I took my L, I kept it pushing, I can't break for that.
We do have people that are filing into our session. We do have sessions that are running concurrently for this time slot. For the last couple of sessions, they were just running, we just had one session at a time. So we obviously, Black excellence is rich in content, and we have a lot that we have to pack in 30 minutes. So I would really kind of like to start on time with this conversation. So welcome. And thank you for being here with us tonight. I'm watching the numbers kind of, rapidly increase. So let's launch right into it. So welcome everyone. Welcome Black Excellence. Thank you for joining us tonight. And the purpose of this conversation is talking about pushing for Black spaces in corporate America. So we're going to pack as much of this as we can in the 30 minutes. And I'd really like to start off to have our panelists introduce ourselves. I'll start with saying I'm Lauren Holland. I'm the chair of Wall Street Friends. So one of the organizers of tonight's event, and want to thank everyone again for being here. You have the chat. Obviously, it's probably your third session, so you kind of know how that works. Please feel free to say hi, post any questions there, and I will start with Suliaman. So please introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Lauren. Glad to be here also with Charles as well on this panel. My name is Suliaman Rahman. I'm based in Philadelphia, also now living in Atlanta as well, living in 2 cities. Background, I've been an entrepreneur for many years. I'm the CEO of DiverseForce. It's an evolution of a professional network we built here, over 18,000 professionals in the region. DiverseForce is a diversity recruitment, retention, and development firm, where we work with many companies around diversity recruiting. We do advisory services and consulting with companies around those topics, and just overall institutionalizing diversity across the organization, as well as we have a development program where it's called DiverseForce on Boards. And we in turn actually do leadership development through board training in partnership with the University of Pennsylvania. We have 135 alumni, placed folks on nonprofit board, over 80 placements. And these are folks who are emerging as senior leaders and also preparing for for-profit boards. We've also made some placements there as well. So excited to be here. Excited about the conversation, and I'll turn it back to you, Lauren, or I'll turn it to you.
Charles Coleman.
Thanks, Lauren. Good evening, everyone. So glad as well to be joining you and Suliaman for this conversation. My name is Charles Coleman Jr. I am a civil rights attorney by trade, who has, over the course of the last several years, taken my experience in the criminal justice sector as well as in the employment sector and sort of fused those to brand myself as a diversity and inclusion expert. That has come at learning a lot and sort of experiencing a number of different corporate spaces on the employment side, and then essentially teaching companies the difference between what it is to sort of satisfy what you need legally as an EEO, professional, but then going further in terms of how do you curate cultural competency in workplaces? How do you curate spaces that ultimately are going to be comfortable and work well for all of your employees so that they have good experiences? So that's my background. I've consulted a number of different companies, both small and large, several Fortune 100 companies, a few Fortune 500 companies, and then nonprofits as well as government organizations. And so one of the things that I do is called Ally Academy, where we basically build and instruct trainings tailored to different workspaces based off of their needs and their goals, and helping them to achieve what it is that they want around diversity and inclusion in the workplace.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those introductions. Okay, so let's launch right into it. The burning question that has been touched upon in some of the other sessions tonight, do we think this time is different? The conversation on diversity, the statements that we've seen from corporations, the testimonials, do we think this time is different? So Suliaman, do we think this time is different?
That's a great question, Laura. I do see facets of commitment, and not only commitment within the companies, but also externally. There's a different environment externally. Obviously, we've seen seismic shifts in demographics. We've also recognized that companies and leadership are certainly recognizing that Diversity is no longer a nice thing to have. It's not just a moral thing to do, that it's a business imperative for them to survive. Capital markets are also moving towards ESG alignment, environmental, social, and governance, which under social is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I see a lot of kind of that perfect storm where if we truly take advantage of this opportunity, we can make some seismic shifts. I think in business, in employment as well as entrepreneurship as well. So I'm optimistic that we can turn this moment into a movement that continues.
Charles?
Sure. I think that, this moment has to be properly placed within its context. And I think that every time that we've seen different things that have moved this conversation around social justice, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace, there's been a step forward. And this is perhaps the biggest step forward that we've seen in a very long time. So in a lot of ways, it is a different space that we're in, but it's also a part of a continuum that has been going on over and over and over again. I think the one thing that we do have working, and Suliaman alluded to this in his remarks, is we have to take this opportunity both internally and externally to make sure that we do what we can in our own spaces to continue to apply pressure. We don't want to lose this momentum. And so we have a lot of power right now at the table in terms of speaking up and making sure our voices are heard. And it's imperative that we use that power to make sure that we don't get blown under the radar.
Fair. Okay. So having said that, I'll frame this, from my personal experience, and I'm sure the experience of, most of the people that are here in the room. So when I was a young associate at Lehman Brothers, my first, post B school job, I was a member of the diversity recruiting team, and I was, called on to attend, the AMBA conference, not only in my alma mater Booth, but I went to Harvard, I went to Wharton. And I did it, not because, I was necessarily compensated extra for it, but I did it because, one, I wanted to do it, but two, because the reality was that there was no one else to do it. Like, I was one out of, 2 African Americans in my associate class, and one out of maybe, 4 African Americans or actually probably 3 African Americans that were in front office, that were of color at the firm at the time, period. So there wasn't much of a bench to actually be present to serve that role. So having said that, what are your thoughts around, in this particular moment, as many of us have been, existing employees at corporations being basically tapped on the shoulder to do this work in this moment, if it is indeed different? Charles?
So we have seen a lot of cost cutting and corner cutting, as I like to call it, from corporations who may be well intended, but have not made the full investment into diversity during this time. And what they have done oftentimes is that they like to facilitate internal conversations. That's the sort of buzzword. We want to have an internal conversation. And what they do, unfortunately, is that they put their Black employees sort of in a fishbowl on display and ask them to tell us about your experiences in Blackness, as if that is supposed to be the remedy for a diversity problem that they have internally. That is perhaps one of the biggest mistakes that I see corporations make repeatedly, especially during times like these. While it does seem to make sense for most people, it's a highly unethical practice. Now, let me break this down very quickly for you. What we're talking about essentially are systems of systemic oppression that are rooted in economic disparity. The source of that economic disparity is slavery, it's free labor. When you take people who are assigned to do whatever it is that they are assigned to do in their respective jobs and positions, and you then ask them, by virtue of the fact that they identify as Black or as female or as male or what have you, and you ask them to do extra on account of their affiliation with said affinity group, you are unethically asking them to do work for free. That's what it boils down to. This is an ethical violation of the worst kind, and it's wholly ironic because it's supposed to be at a time where we're actually combating systemic oppression, but what you're doing is you're harping and you're drawing from that systemic oppression in terms of trying to remedy it. So it's a terrible practice. And I think that it's one of those things that oftentimes finds us as employees very, very challenged in terms of calling it out and speaking truth to power in a way that actually says to our employers, listen, you need to make an actual investment in terms of your diversity efforts. You need to engage competent, trained professionals, because at the end of the day, you may just come as a Black employee to work in order just to work. That's it. You don't want to necessarily be put in a position where you have to share your experiences in Blackness in order to be validated or accepted among your peers, because they want to sort of cut corners on spending on actual diversity efforts. So I've seen it, I frown at it, and I encourage folks who are in positions when they're asked about it to, you know, be courageous enough to speak up about the fact that this is not the way that you do this. This is problematic. You are doubly victimizing me as a person of color in your workplace.
Yeah. And I would just add, and I agree with Charles, I believe that we have to also, take agency and make sure self-care, that we're not overextending ourselves. However, I know that there are many people who are within these corporate, institutions, and they want to participate in the change. And unfortunately, many times these are stretch assignments that was leading the employee resource group or different initiatives, or being the focus group, if you will. That's not factored into performance reviews. It's not factored into their job description, which can be considered to make sure that they're not overloaded if that is something they decide to take on as a stretch assignment for the organization. I don't want us to squander this moment to also to lead the conversation as well. To Charles's point, to make sure that the organization is making an investment into DEI, and not expecting for you or your coworkers to do free labor. But you don't want those companies talking about you without talking to you as well, and making sure that we're at the table helping to influence decision-making, who they actually hire for this work, and making sure the work is done in a way that advances our communities as well.
And I think part of it is understanding the nuance of what we're talking about, right? The conversation in America around race and culture, particularly at this moment, does involve a significant amount of nuance. And oftentimes what happens is you have companies that are not in that space who are looking to engage employees in that space who aren't trained to do that. And that's another reason why it's important that, you can solicit participation and support internally from your currently existing employees, but there's a way to do that. And oftentimes the people who are asking for that involvement aren't trained. They're not the proper persons to frame those conversations. And that's why it's important that you engage competent and experienced diversity professionals in order to actually frame that ask in a way that's not going to be offensive, and that's not going to sort of siphon off work from people without paying them for their experience.
Fair, got it. So the next question is, and I think, Suliaman, you talked about this, you kind of touched on this in your last response. So, so what actually is the right thing to do? Let's kind of dig into that a little bit, because one thing that we like to do here on this platform about Black excellence, and just me as, as a person, is like, we want to give people like actionable solutions, that things that they can leave here with, that they can actually take to their workplace, and be equipped with, to actually affect change. So if their company is saying that, like, okay, we're actually going to do something, like this time is different, what are some key components of a actual policy, like an actual D&I policy, so to speak, that that define like a good policy, or a structure, or a policy period? Like, one of the things they should look for. So, Suliaman, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I mean, one is from a recruiting perspective. One of the things that we work with companies around is having a diverse slate of candidates. We see that diversity dies in the middle of the organization many times. A lot of frontline workers are people of color, but as we move up into the organizational chart, there's less diversity. So it's important to make sure organizations, do address their implicit bias in that whole, the pipeline of recruiting, that whole talent process. but also that they have a diverse slate of candidates before they make a hire. I know there's companies that are kind of taking on the Rooney Rule, if you will, where the NFL requires at least one person of color, and now gender diversity as well. But there is research that shows that just having one candidate in that slate does not move the needle. You have to have at least two or more candidates in that slate to actually see, that policy actually move the needle. So that's one thing that we can really think about to make sure that companies are not moving forward and just hiring friends or having this internal network of people who are referring their friends, continue perpetuating the problem of lack of diversity in professional roles. And as well.
So I look at it, more as trying to explain to clients and businesses that I work with that, diversity and creating a diverse workforce is not a destination, it is a journey. It is a journey of continuous refinement around what type of culture you are creating in your workspace. So why is that important? It's important because you have to incorporate a number of targeted measurables and deliverables that you want to have in terms of being able to stay on target and know exactly are you achieving your goals. But on a broader sense, the first question you should be asking if you're an employee at a company or you're looking to join a company is, if diversity is a concern, do you have a strategic diversity plan? What is your strategic diversity plan? Because in order for you to have a strategic diversity plan, that means that you know exactly where you are in terms of diversity, that you know where you actually want to get to, and then you also have identified methods and pathways to actually get there. So recruitment is one way, retention and mentorship is another, training and education is another. So these are all components of things that would go into a strategic diversity plan. So that's one of the first things that I talk to clients about. I ask them, if you look at any, Fortune 500 company and you ask them, what is your 5-year outlook? What is your 3-year outlook? They have very clear and outlined plans as to what it is that they want to achieve during that time and how they intend to achieve it. But with diversity, it's almost kind of for a lot of folks like, well, we just want more Black people. That's not how it works, right? Like there's an actual need to strategically look at where we are. That can require anything from a cultural audit to an actual real diversity audit, to look at where your numbers are, to actually looking at how are we curating talent that is going to be able to provide us with a diverse applicant pool, as well as an internal pipeline for promotion and partnership or being on board of directors, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of that, all of those things are things that come out of a strategic diversity plan. So that could be the number one question that anyone working for a corporation asks their boss or their CEO or their vice president of diversity. What is our strategic diversity plan? And if we don't have one, how can we get one? And how do we make sure that the current employees who know this company backwards and forwards are a part in providing input?
And one step further, how are they operationalizing that plan? Some people will develop it, check the box, but making sure that they have KPIs.
Execution.
Right, exactly. Great. So let me, to kind of build upon that, what are some of the indicators the companies that are serious about D&I put forth? So you kind of just alluded to, like, that they actually actionalize the plan. So, like, how do you know that a company is actually serious about diversity?
So that's a really good question. I like to do, one of the things that I offer, and it's always a curious conversation that I have with company leadership, is doing a cultural audit. And cultural audits are usually qualitative, data gathering in terms of interviewing cross sections of employees to actually see what does the experience of being in this workplace feel like for different types of employees at different levels. And I combine that with a real diversity audit. And a real diversity audit looks at more than just your percentages and your numbers. It looks at actual positions, because we all know that you can walk in the door of a number of companies and they have tons of Black faces, but those are the folks in the copy machine, those are the folks in the mail room, those are the folks who are answering the phones. And the higher and higher you get up that ladder, the whiter and whiter the faces are. And so what a real diversity audit does is that it actually looks at the numbers in terms of promotion, in terms of recruitment, in terms of retention, and it analyzes it in a way that gives you a much clearer picture around where that company stands from a diversity standpoint. So for me, those things are actual data inquiries that I will make in terms of making an assessment around where a company is on diversity. But perhaps the biggest indicator is, what is your actual investment regarding diversity and in diversity engagement? Where does that fit in your budget? Is it a line item? Is it the one that's always getting cut? Is it getting increased? Because at the end of the day, that's oftentimes where you can determine what a company's priorities are, is how much money they're willing to invest in terms of engaging those efforts, both internally and with external support like Suliaman and myself.
Right. And that is one thing to note is there may be capital. So, we've seen many headlines. Like I just saw a headline from a major chemical company this week that said they were allocating $50 million over the next 5 years, right? This is a company that has annual top line over $30 billion, right? But they're, putting $50 million over the next 5 years towards diversity, right? And so I actually know someone that works at the company, and I asked okay, so what is the capital being, directed towards? And it's mostly being directed internally, right? For internal development, not necessarily towards increased recruiting, not necessarily towards community development, but internally towards development. So basically trying to training, awareness, anti-racial, anti-bias type stuff. But as you stated, the minute they have a bad quarter,
it gets cut. First thing to get cut, right?
And I would say, Lauren, that diversity starts at the top of the organization. And to Charles's point, one indicator is obviously what you see on their board, what you see in the leadership, diversity throughout the organization, but also how people feel, and that's more qualitative around retention and development of that talent as well. There's many domains where diversity lives within the organization. It's not just in HR. It's not just in talent management. It's in your leadership and your governance we talked about. It's in, to your point, more in corporate social responsibility. It's in supplier diversity. How are you spending your dollars with your vendors? So there's many metrics that you can look at. And one indicator is if you do have a chief diversity officer, where do they sit within the organization? How much power do they actually have? And everyone directing that, the diversity conversations to the DEI officer, or is everyone talking about it? Is it built into their performance reviews? Are DEI metrics built into the performance reviews of hiring managers and leaders to make sure that, again, it's institutionalized throughout the organization?
To give you an example of that, I know that in Maryland.
Charles, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but this is my favorite thing I want to touch upon, because obviously, I'm an investment analyst, and I'm curious from your perspective, from both your perspective, because incentives, I'm a U Chicago, grad, so incentives is, part of our thing. Tell me, when that is put forth, generally, what sort of feedback do you get from executives when you want to tie this to their compensation?
So I think that, one of the things that makes these conversations a lot easier is a lot of times in business, what you will find is that industries are full of copycats. And so if you can convince an industry leader or someone who has credibility within the industry that this should be something that they make a part of their work life experience, oftentimes because companies want to remain competitive, they're interested in their listening. So one of the best examples in this regard is Merrill Lynch. Merrill Lynch institutionally created a system where, as it related to people at supervisory levels, a part of their bonuses actually is tied to diversity in terms of their recruitment, their retention, their hiring, what their team looks like, how much work they're getting people, what type of pipeline they're creating for their employees. Now, of course, there's a separate conversation to be had because, as we all know, in corporate spaces, diversity has been expanded to mean many different things. But as a principle, I think that is an industry example that I oftentimes use because it resonates with folks. They're like, oh, well, if Merrill Lynch is doing it, it must be okay, so on and so forth. And so I think that for this conversation to have occurred 5 or 7 years ago, i.e. tying incentives to diversity goals and diversity metrics, it would probably have been met with a lot more pushback. But when you create a strategic diversity plan, and again, you create a culture where diversity is actually valued, it only makes sense, because then you're able to say to them, well, all right, you've said this plan, or you set forth this plan where you've said that diversity is a priority for your company. This is how you actualize it. These are the steps that you take in order to make that consistent. And I think oftentimes when you lay it out there, the conversation becomes a lot easier. But the last thing I'll say on this point, to Suliman's last point, I think a huge part of what our work is determined by is how serious is your leadership. I'm always curious to see who's in the room when I'm doing presentations, who's in the room in terms of actually attending different workshops and trainings that I do, who's in the room in terms of being able to empower and support the diversity efforts of an organization, because it makes no sense for me to go to an organization and talk to all the Black people about diversity. I don't need to do that. They don't need to hear that. It's the managing partners, it's the hiring partners, it's the department heads, it's those folks, right? So in terms of leadership, that is really where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. Because, and I always say it, that if your leadership is not serious about diversity, then the rest of the company is going to know, and they're going to know very quickly. So in that regard, that's also sort of part of the pitch that I make in terms of how do we execute this strategic diversity plan that we've put together, and incentive-based, diversity measurables are oftentimes a huge target in terms of making that happen.
Charles, you do have a question with regard to that point about how do they avoid discrimination suits with respect to those incentives? So
it's a matter of creating a formula. It's not about quotas. It's about, it's not about a quota. It's not about setting targets in the sense of you have to have X amount of Black. And that's where the conversation about diversity is wonky. And what I mean by that is, we've entered in a space where diversity, unfortunately, has minimized race, but there are a number of different categories in terms of what it means to look like, to build a diverse team. Obviously, that encompasses members of your team of different genders, some members who may not identify with a gender, members of different religions, members, of different backgrounds. So there are a number of different ways that can be constructed in a way that can create formulas that do not run afoul of anti-discrimination laws in the workplace. And because I have the background that I do with respect to EEO law, that's something that I sort of specialize in terms of making sure that those companies don't run afoul in terms of violating anyone's federally protected civil rights.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I think, and actually, I think that, any final thoughts, we literally have 2 minutes here. I think we talked a bit about policy. We talked about, kind of empowering, professionals to kind of keep the discussion going, things to look for with regard to, make sure there is a policy, to have a actually strategic plan for diversity. But if either of you kind of have 1 minute, kind of that last thing that you want to impart, our audience here with, as they kind of go forth, to kind of, to keep the conversation going and to keep the charge going for diversity.
I would just say that I know that it can feel burdensome to be that person who can potentially take the lead on.
We're still pioneers in 2020, for that matter. But
say it again. Say it one more time.
That we're still pioneers in 2020.
Yeah, pioneers. But to make sure that you have people like a Charles, have people in your back pocket that vendors, people that you can recommend, so you can play quarterback within these organizations. You can you can be an advocate to make sure you redirect them to the right people, because I tell you, I talked about dimensions of diversity that will love to have the power to make those recommendations. And many times we whitewash diversity, and next thing you know, We're talking about LGBT. We're talking about so many other dimensions of diversity. Not that that is not important, but we know that there's a historical, challenges that Black and brown people have in this country, and it's important that we keep it top of mind, tip of tongue, as we hope to move the needle forward.
Yes.
I would just sort of echo that statement and say that, right now, this is an opportunity where the bullhorn is in our hands, and there's an opportunity for folks who are at workspaces, regardless of how small or how large the population of Black folks at your job is. You have an opportunity to galvanize them together around this cause and use that bullhorn to keep that pressure on. It's important that you all let people know, look, we are here. This is important to us, and we're not going to go away. You have the momentum because of everything that's going on with regard to our climate in America right now. And it's important that you use it. It's important that you keep your foot on the gas so that you can get competent support outside of your organization to make sure that your workplace functions the way that it should. It's important to have a list of folks like you, like Suliaman said, like Suliaman, like myself, like other folks who are in the space, who know what we're talking about, who are experienced, and who are able to bring that to your workplace, and that you follow up. It's not that you just turn the list in. You say, like, listen, we gave you 5 different names of folks. Why are we not necessarily hearing from them? Like, that's what we have to take advantage of in this moment to make sure that we get the most out of it.
Yes. So, gentlemen, Brian is tapping us all on the shoulder. So if you could please, take a second, pop your LinkedIn in the chat, so everyone knows how to add you to their Rolodex and have you as a resource as needed. I appreciate your time, and everyone in the session, take a second, click on that, connect with them, have them as a resource. So you don't have to be, necessarily become the, the diversity expert for your firm, and head on over to the stage.
I took my L, I kept it pushing, I can't break for that.